All right, Nature of Science, Part 2. We are back. This is College Prep Physics, and we are going to cover Part 2 of our lecture on Unit 1, The Nature of Science. We're defining science in terms of pure versus applied. We're looking at steps to the scientific method, and we're going to pay close attention to the problem or the question. We're going to look at how experiments are designed, including some variables. Let's first define what science is. Pure science is research based, it adds to a body of scientific knowledge. Maybe a biologist in the lab is finding out how chemicals go in and out of cells just for no practical use, just to find out how those processes work. How do cells metabolize? Well, a doctor might apply that technology. They may not have come up with the knowledge, but they could apply that technology to say medicine and prescriptions. It's a practical application of scientific knowledge. So we have pure science, and then technology is applied science. Here's a quick example. This picture is taken from a very special microscope called an electron microscope. And the electron microscope allows us to see these bird feathers very up close. This extreme close up of the feathers gives us knowledge. So, in this case, the technology of the electron microscope is helping build the base of the scientific knowledge. And then maybe someone with that scientific knowledge can apply it to something. Some observations found from the electron microscope include the layering of the feathers. It sort of makes a hook and barb feature. This helps the bird trap air. The bird can be insulated, meaning it's not going to get too cold when it puffs up its feathers. The bird can also repel water when it locks these hooks and barbs together. Let's take it one step further and add to the technology. Here's a close up picture of something every day we use. This is Velcro. And fun fact, it was first developed by NASA so astronauts could sleep and not flop around and fly around in zero gravity. All right. That example was one. Let's take a look at four more examples. Pure science would be human genetics. You'd study this in biology. You would learn about DNA. You'd learn about chromosomes. You would learn about how DNA makes RNA and RNA makes proteins. You would learn about Watson and Crick. Bonus points, I'm sure you heard of Rosalind Franklin. Polymer science. This would be something you learn in chemistry. The polymer science tells us how chemicals form long chains. What can we do with that? Well, we just know it. It's pure science. Atomic theory. This would be something you do in chemistry or even in physics. You would learn about what the atoms are made out of. You would learn about radiation. Why does radiation happen? How does radiation happen? Well, that's just the pure science. It's the knowledge of radiation. It's no application so far. In anatomy and physiology, you will learn how the ear works. Here's a fun fact about the ear: the smallest bones in your body are inside the ear. So, science by itself doesn't do anything, it's a way of knowing. Applied science in our technology, let's apply human genetics. Crime scene investigation, forensics uses DNA fingerprinting. You can figure out if the suspect is innocent or guilty based on their DNA evidence. Polymers can be used to make fabrics. It stretches, it expands. Lycra is one of those fabrics. Atomic theory can be used for many applications, nuclear power, but most people remember atomic theory and radiation when they think of atomic and nuclear weapons. And I think everybody knows someone that uses and benefits from a hearing aid. We're going to transition to part C, the scientific method here. We're going to take a look at what all scientific methods have in common, and that is they contain a hypothesis, and a hypothesis is a cause and effect. It's a prediction, it's an educated guess, it's an if then statement. But most importantly, guys, your hypothesis has to be testable. You have to be able to test your hypothesis, or else it's not really good for anything. The theory is what happens after multiple results explaining why. Theories can change, and even laws can change. But these theories are based on many observations and experimental results. The laws, they're not written by the courts or the Congress or some council, but they do predict what? It seems to be a repeatable pattern that happens in nature. They describe what goes up must come down. The scientific law of gravity is different than a theory because it doesn't seek to explain how gravity works. It just tells us a predictable pattern. Now, theories and laws are well accepted by scientists, but we said earlier nothing is immortal. You can say they are not set in stone, meaning they can change with new information, and technology sometimes complements that new information. So they are revised when new information is discovered. One of the things that's happening right now, two things. Fusion is closer and closer to being achieved. That's a type of nuclear reaction that could power many, many cities, and they're just starting to get to a point where they can think that they started this chain reaction. They think they started it or initialized it. Now, with another piece of technology that's out there is James Webb Telescope. The mirror in our classroom, the one with the hexagons, that is a model of the James Webb Telescope. And if you didn't know, it is seeing some things in space that disagree with our common accepted theories of how the universe expands. The evidence that we're seeing from this new space telescope is telling us that the universe is not expanding at the same speed that we thought it was before. That could possibly turn all of our knowledge of physics on its ear. So, all of our scientific methods need to start with a problem or a question. I say this because we've generally been taught in elementary and middle school that you need to do observations or research first. And that is true. You do observations, you do research, but you eventually you have to have a problem, something that you want to solve, something you're trying to determine. So the first step always is a question or a problem. After that, then you can form your hypothesis. Of course, your hypothesis is testable, so you're going to test it. Thirdly, what do you think we do what do you think we do next? You analyze the results. Those results can lead you to conclusions. Lastly, all right, let's determine the problem. We'll go through an example here. When the Titanic sank, what happened to the water level on shore? So there's a question. We don't know. Did the water go up? Did it go down? Did it stay the same? There's really only three possible hypotheses there. A lot of you might think the water level rose, and that would seem to make sense when you imagine it. You might think the water level dropped. Obviously, we're not on the shore. We can't measure it. The water could have stayed the same. How could we model this? Me personally, I would use a tank or a sink or a container or a bathtub and then model the Titanic with an object like a toy boat. So you can really have one of three hypotheses. The water became greater, less than, or stayed the same. And it's okay if you think one or the other or a little bit of both. But maybe you thought it rose and then stayed the same, or maybe you thought it stayed the same and then rose. Let's take a look at it. Testing the hypothesis, I mentioned we could test it with a tank, a tub, a sink, analyze the results. Well, you need to measure this. So, in a tank, a tub, or a sink, you could use a ruler, a meter stick, a rope. You could mark lines on the side of the container. So, what happens during our test? Did the water go up? Did it go down? And then from that, we can draw conclusions. Was your hypothesis correct? Do you have to revise your hypothesis? Do you need to test it again? What would you do differently? In this case, I'm going to use the bathtub method. Let's say you can put a toy boat in the bathtub. Now, this toy boat here has a solid part to it, but inside there's air. So, just like the real Titanic, there was air inside the empty space of the boat. And just like the real Titanic, if this sank, initially the water may have rose a little, but it was already risen from the boat being on top. When more of the solid and the gas went into the water, it would displace or make water rise. But after the gases escaped out of the holes and the openings, then the water would have gone down a little. In the terms of our giant oceans, any changes would have been millions of inches. It would have been tiny, tiny fractions of inches that you wouldn't even be able to perceive because it's such a large body of water. Well, with a model like this, you can find it a lot easier to measure because it's on a small scale. Another way to do experimental design, think of it as just an organized procedure for testing a hypothesis. Think of it as a way of putting your idea to the test. Here's some key components to these experiments, guys. A control. A control is always your standard for comparison. So if I wanted to see if a new vitamin will help me work out faster or work out stronger, then I'm going to compare it to not using the vitamin. So the control is our standard, what we're expecting to happen without any changes. And the single variable has to be in our experiment. I can't take a vitamin and drink a monster. You need to test either the vitamin or the monster. Pick one. So you have to keep all your other factors constant. Think of a single variable. Remember in class I said it wouldn't be fair if we ran a race against our opponent and they were in mud and we were on a track? That's not a controlled experiment at all. And of course, you need to repeat your trials. The more the sample size, the greater reliability you're going to have. That's why all the time in science class, your teachers would have you do 3, 5, or more trials and then take averages. People make mistakes, and you want to show that it's repeatable and that your experiment is reliable. With that said, let's talk about types of variables. Independent variable starts with the letter I. So I adjust what's happening to the independent variable. It's adjusted by the experimenter. This is what you change, what you vary. Let's take the example of the fans in our classroom. It's very, very hot in there. Let's say I bring in more fans from home. That's an adjustment I'm making. The number of fans would be the independent variable. Now, what happens after you bring the fans in are the changes. Those are the changes in response to the independent variable, and I can actually measure this. I can measure the outcome or the results of the cause. So, independent variable is the cause, dependent variable is the effect. In the case of the fans, the dependent variable would be changes in temperature. And we would hope it would get cooler in there, wouldn't we? Here's one that you can do at home. I have a hypothesis about popcorn. It's really annoying when you make popcorn and there's extra kernels left over. I think if I store the popcorn in the freezer, then there will be fewer unpopped kernels. So if then, cause, freezer, effect, fewer unpopped kernels. What am I going to have as a control variable? My standard popcorn is always stored at room temperature. I keep it in a cabinet. You might keep it in a pantry. You might keep it on top of your fridge, but it's always going to be about room temperature when it's in your home. If temperature is the thing we're testing, then there can only be one single variable, right? Storage temperature. We can't test storage temperature and adding butter or storage temperature and using a kettle versus using a microwave. All of these things that have to stay the same, we call constants. The popcorn brand is an example of a constant. You're not going to test Jiffy Pop versus Orville Redenbacher. You're going to keep everything the same. You're not going to have old popcorn versus new popcorn. You can't say, "Oh, this expired popcorn didn't really pop." That's two variables you're testing. Keep everything the same. Use the same bag. Just split it and put it in the freezer. Put half of it in the pantry. The storage time, that's a good one. Don't store it in the freezer for 5 minutes and then store the one in the pantry for 24 hours. Store them for the same amount of time before you run the test. And I said earlier, the popping methods. If you're going to test this and you're testing one on the stovetop, you have to test the other on the stovetop too. Fun fact about popcorn, you don't need to buy microwavable popcorn bags. You can use those brown paper lunch bags and throw kernels in there. There's enough water contained in them to throw into the microwave for a short amount of time, and you can microwave popcorn in a brown paper bag. Don't believe me? Try it at home. All right. Our independent variable in the popcorn trial is storage temperature. Our dependent variable is measurable. It's the number of unpopped kernels left over. I can literally count them. So I really like this type of experiment as example because it has quantifiable information. We're going to spend some time in this unit talking about quantifiable, meaning number related. It's measurable. All of our great experiments have measurable results. All right, that's the end of part 2, and we'll catch you in part 3.